Life's tough
when you're in PC.
Life's rough
When you depend on me.
to give you
weapons
items,
and
your information for your journey and still you still machine to try to hurt me. Life's tough
when you're in PC.
Life's rough.
So, alright, we had to talk about this eventually. I mean, I've been at the show for about a year now, so eventually we had to talk about this. We had to talk about what is considered to be one of the biggest betrayals in all of gaming. This is the game that sent people flocking back to 3.5, and 3.5 wasn't that great to begin with. This is the game that pretty well disenfranchised D&D for the longest time. This is the one that almost completely killed it for D&D until 5th edition came out and we had the big D&D like renaissance that we see now with shows like Critical Role out there to really push the buck and seeing all these new and inventive games come out. None of that might not be happening today if they had not crawled out of the hole that they dug themselves for when it came to D&D 4th edition. And I want to say, before I go on and get into this, and to silence a bit of the comment section, D&D 4th edition is not even in the top 10 worst games of all time. This is considered to be a bad game from the perspective of those who have not touched things like Fatal, The Spawn of Fashan, Hot Chicks, Leading Edge games, and so forth. So let it be known that at the bare minimum level, this game is playable, it is okay, it is fine, quote unquote. But when you compare it to what it is and the company that it keeps, you start to feel a little tad disappointed. Alright. Boy, is that the understatement of the century. But here's the thing, is that it's not one of the worst things to ever be made when it comes to gaming. Whenever we talk about 4th edition, this is like Quentin Tarantino's Death Proof compared to his movies, or Kingdom of the Crystal Skull compared to the rest of Spielberg's movies, or like Arkham Origins from the Arkham series, the Batman series that came out, that include Arkham City, Arkham Asylum, some of the best games ever made. This is the functionally mediocre game that, whenever you put it with the rest of the company of AD&D, the original Dungeons & Dragons, now 5th edition, it just comes across as terrible. So for this episode, we're really breaking this down into two parts. The historical narrative that brought us to this point, and then the functional problems of D&D 4th edition that saw it nearly drag the whole franchise into rock bottom, never thought imagined when the game was in the true first run with AD&D. So for the sake of history, let us go back, all the way back to the distant year 2000. D&D had been in dire straits since the dark times had taken hold. The D20 open system times, after the true majesty of AD&D, had ruled the roost for the better part of the 80s and 90s. D&D 3rd edition and its correcting, quote-unquote, 3.5 edition had come out just after we were shifting into the year 2000 and moving into the year 2003. Go back and watch my 3.5 video for some more context on the problems with 3.5 and 3rd edition, but long story short, for the better part of 7 years, leading up to 2007, a lot of people just felt unsatisfied and disappointed in Dungeons & Dragons, in a game that had, for the most part, become more of a miniature game than an RPG, and far too mechanical to truly allow good role-playing to occur. There was also another problem on the surface, though. A problem that was brewing as technology was progressing forward. The Internet. D&D and tabletops in general took a crushing blow with the rise of the MMORPG. What was started by one of the original fantasy epics, Ultima, with the creation of Ultima Online, saw a massive rise in turning role-playing to the world of online gaming. This was during like the halcyon years of MMORPGs, with Ultima came others soon following it. For those of you from the early 2000s, please let me say the words RuneScape, and I guarantee you that's going to elicit some nostalgia for a lot of people who grew up in that time, myself included, and also I know there are plenty that still play it. But let's be honest here. When we talk about MMORPGs, we can talk about Ultima being the first, RuneScape being the really free, fun online game. But we all know we want to talk about the big one. World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft came out at the perfect time for fantasy fans. 2004 was the year after the release of 3.5. MMOs were heating up, and it was World of Warcraft that struck when the iron was hot. Granted, you would have had people running to World of Warcraft regardless, because D&D and World of Warcraft are on two different entertainment mediums. But the problem was with the disenchantment with D&D after 3rd edition and 3.5, it left a lot of people wondering why they would even bother picking up these massive amounts of books again when they had World of Warcraft on their computers to play instead. Obviously this isn't or wasn't the case. D&D and World of Warcraft satisfy different needs, different urges, and in truth, no, D&D was never going to go away, no matter how much people got onto blogs or would talk to their friends about how the tabletop days were dead and MMOs were the way of the future. That wasn't going to happen. That's absolute bullshit. But I will give those people who said that this. This came out at the time whenever D&D and tabletop gaming were hurting, and they were hurting bad. Not to mention with the D20 system that homogenized games for the better part of a couple of years, people really were starting to ask the big questions. Whenever you're seeing World of Warcraft booming, MMOs being created, all these different interesting things, where is this really leaving the world of role-playing games? So what is D&D going to do? They have had 7 years of futility and complaints with 3.5, with a modest following still latching on, but nowhere near the attention of AD&D. Well, similar to the Uncharted and Tomb Raider tautological loop of copying and recopying, D&D looked at the thing that they helped create and inspire. Now, I am not going to say that 4th edition just copied World of Warcraft. I am not going to say that D&D 4th edition is just paper version MMORPG. What I am going to say, though, is that you can definitely see where the inspiration was. You can definitely see where World of Warcraft heavily inspired D&D creators during this time. And it was to the point that it looks so much like an MMORPG, it looks so much like World of Warcraft, where disenfranchised D&D fans, still upset about 3.5, are looking at 4th edition and saying, please, remember who you are. From the artwork, to the new additions of the game, to the mechanical structure, and so forth, D&D had taken a lot of inspiration from World of Warcraft, as well as other MMOs at the time, trying to hop on the piggyback of what was being created at the time. Unfortunately, it didn't exactly work out so well for them. The biggest complaint that you'll find from players who talk about why they dislike 4th edition, aside from mechanical discussions, is that D&D 4th edition was essentially World of Warcraft on paper. Now, there is some validity to that. However, not exactly the entire case, but I think that it really is worth discussing. Before we get into the mechanics of the game, just how much of D&D 4th edition is World of Warcraft. This isn't plagiarism level of problems, but it certainly is clear that D&D, as opposed to sticking to what made them unique or trying to distance themselves from this phenomenon, tried to at least bring people into what was popular at the time, and in doing so, went a little too far to the point where it alienates its fans and doesn't bring in any MMO fans because it's not the same medium and they want to play a video game instead of a tabletop. Taking inspiration for something is fine. There is no problem with that. That's how a lot of art kind of gets generated, as you look at your forebears, you look at work that some of your other colleagues are doing, and you start to build on top of that. It's not a problem to take inspiration from something, don't get me wrong here. But whenever you take so much inspiration that your voice and who you are is lost and all you can see is a copy of what is the inspiration, then we need to have words. I once again bring up the discussion of Tomb Raider and Uncharted, two similar games that have clearly taken inspiration and cues from one another. Tomb Raider, in its original form, is an absolute classic and will go down as one of the all-time greats in video gaming, especially during the time of the mid-90s and into the early 2000s when it was made. So when Uncharted comes out, once again, well, coincidentally, in 2007, it is clear that it has taken inspiration from its forebearer and is trying to create a new and interesting game based off of games before it, even taking the spirit of Tomb Raider into the next generation. Well then, Tomb Raider gets rebooted, as several things tend to do, and it is clear that the creators saw the creation of Uncharted and wanted a piece of that sexy visual and storytelling action. As such, this is why you really don't see a lot of praise for the new Tomb Raider series. I mean, you do still see praise, don't get me wrong there either, but is it really to the extent of the fervor and the passion that the original created? Not even close. Nowhere near as close as what the original really elicited from people. These Tomb Raiders, they're taking so much from Uncharted and created this giant loop of taking inspiration from one, the other one takes inspiration from the other, and in these loops, it doesn't really work out so well for the original whenever they try to copy the one that copied them. We see a similar thing here with the circular relationship of World of Warcraft and D&D. World of Warcraft takes inspiration from D&D and brings a D&D-like MMORPG to the computer world. D&D, seeing their star waning in the new world, copies that which gained inspiration from them, and as such the product is generally an unsatisfying mess. Because of this, you see World of Warcraft permeate through all of D&D 4th edition, in the mechanics as well as in the artwork as well. Let's start with the races, where you see a lot of inspiration in the artwork design and restructuring occur. First off, it is generally a bad idea to take away in an RPG. You tend to want to add on to your future editions. You don't want to remove things. You don't want to minimize. You need to be really careful about this if you're expecting more in the future. Because to take away something is a huge problem for those especially who enjoy it. Because those who lose always feel like you pushed them out, that they don't matter anymore. So even though half-orcs and gnomes show up in Handbook 2 of 4th edition, the removal from Handbook 1 didn't do them any favors. For those who enjoyed playing half-orcs and gnomes, what's the point of playing D&D 4th edition? I don't want to main an elf or a human or a dwarf. I want to have my main character that I've had in previous editions. But even then, for the ones that stayed, for the staples of Dungeons & Dragons, elves and dwarves, we see a lot of problems there too. It is definitely here in the holy trinity of humans, elves, and dwarves that you see a lot of inspiration from World of Warcraft. It isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's certainly you could see the inspiration there, and for anyone who just wants D&D without World of Warcraft, you just keep rolling your eyes. But the big one, the really big one out of all of these, is one of the starting races known as the Eladrin. The race that looks painfully similar to World of Warcraft elves to the point that they look like they are pretty well related. And the Eladrin are a really cool concept. They are! Don't give me that look! The Eladrin are a cool concept. They're like elves on crack. They're fucking strong and powerful. And they're really an amazing addition to the game in truth. So, why is it, though, that whenever 5th edition came out, Tieflings and Dragonborn make the cut for 5th edition, but the Eladrin, they don't. They get cut until they show up later in a supplement. So why is that the case? Why is it a really cool race of elf with fairy blood in them gets cut, and nobody really gets sad about that. Whenever I just mentioned a moment ago that people got really upset that gnomes and half-orcs were cut until Handbook 2 came out. The answer, I would argue, is because it reminds people so much of World of Warcraft. In their design and in their manner, Eladrin strike too many similarities to Warcraft elves. Sure, they are quite powerful in a game that is pretty well ultra-balanced out for everyone. But really, these guys, I would say, crossed the line. They went from inspiration to almost becoming copycats. And as such, the general D&D community rejected them almost wholesale until the game called for them and brought them back in 5th edition in a much different way than their 4th edition counterpart. The reason being is simply because whenever a new thing tries to take inspiration from an original product like Uncharted to Tomb Raider and World of Warcraft to D&D, it's something new. It's something inventive. It's something that you may have seen before, but you haven't seen it in this context. And you have your, forebears to really thank for pushing everything forward. Without D&D, World of Warcraft would not be. Without Tomb Raider, Uncharted would not be. And so whenever these franchises are trying to still remain relevant, like Tomb Raider and D&D, and whenever they see the success that these ones have had, and they copy that, it feels very insincere. It feels very... what's the word I'm looking for? That in trying to copy that which copied you, you're simply just losing your identity in order to stay relevant. And that is one of the biggest sins of 4th edition, and one of the biggest praises of 5th edition is that it recaptured its voice. It recaptured what D&D really is. But we can really get into the praise of D&D 5th edition another day. What we really are talking about here is 4th edition, and I've been talking about this World of Warcraft D&D copying problem, and you might start to think that really this is all this video is going to be, is me going on and on about how historically, because D&D copied World of Warcraft, it's never going to be that satisfying. But apparently is the rest of the stuff that good? Well, let's talk about that, because the answer is generally an unsatisfying no. The mechanics of the game are also not that great. Ask anyone who has played 4th edition, and besides World of Warcraft, the other big discussing point that someone will bring up of why they dislike it is because of balance. The game has a problem with balance. Does that mean that mages are running roughshod over everybody? Is it similar to the problem with Shadowrun, where Deckers sometimes feel like the only class that's really worth playing? No, it's actually kind of quite the opposite to that. In this one, it feels like everything is a little too well balanced. I think the more operative word here is that it's too homogeneous. In the early days of D&D, especially AD&D, there was a huge disparity in advantages and disadvantages in class. The typical thing was sort of a decision on how you wanted to do, and how well you wanted to do, and at what time you wanted to do it. It was kind of like an X model on a graph. Fighters, for instance, started off really overpowered, while early day mages typically only had 1d4 hit points and 1 spell, and that was it, without any additional modifiers. However, as time went on, the fighter benefits started to really plateau, while the wizard's benefits increased exponentially. Some didn't quite follow this path, but for the most part, whenever we're talking about like the old school D&D, you had to make the decision, did you want to be the badass now and carry your party back then at the very beginning, or do you want to risk your character potentially dying very easily to potentially be a mega badass whenever level 20 came around? It was a huge debate, and typically you found people choosing one end or the other. Games now start to get a little bit more homogenized, where everybody just kind of is in the middle with a meh, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses and advantages and disadvantages. While 5th edition was better about fixing some of these problems, there was nothing that hit more rock bottom with everything is too well balanced than 4th edition. In 5th edition, there was an effort to backtrack and make characters more different and dynamic as time went on, and also dealing with very different varieties of damage. Everybody feels like they're doing something different. The rogue feels like they're doing something that the mage cannot do. In 4th edition, everything felt, for lack of a better word, the same. Listen, I understand. I'm not a person who tends to like to play mages, so sometimes it really does suck whenever the wizard is just dealing massive amounts of damage and all you really have is a sword hit. But the big problem is whenever you have a spell that's supposed to look and feel like you're doing massive damage, and you're doing the same amount of damage as a sword hit, it doesn't really have the same sort of feeling or meaning whenever everything just feels the same. Sure, it wasn't as bad as something like Fireball doing the same damage as a quarterstaff, but it sure did have the video game effect where there were a few really powerful things and then this big amorphous blob of stuff that basically did only marginally different damage. It was kind of like, let's say, guns in a first-person shooter, where overall the guns do scale up, and they're certainly the biggest, most powerful, but sometimes whenever you're digging through this like sandbox of a world and you found 96 guns, the only differentiating stat between them usually is which is your +1 put into which category at the time. And maybe this one was just me on the few times that I played 4th edition, but battles seem to take even longer than they ever had before, and 3.5 was basically nothing more than a miniature battle game. So, whenever you're sitting there and everything just feels the same, where you feel like you're just kind of doing the same thing, you're going through the motions, and your effects are not any way different from the others in the group, everything just feels like whenever it gets to your turn, you deal your 5 damage to the thing. You only deal your 5, and then you move on to the next person and they deal their 5. So, even though if we really wanted to, get out the battle maps, set out the same number of variables, and see, you'll probably get about similar results, but, man, the homogeneity of just the entire combat system makes everything feel that much longer. Then we have the role-playing problem that was not fixed from 3.5, and even made potentially marginally worse. So yes, this is a problem from 3.5, so 4th edition doesn't deserve all the flack here. Role-playing was, once again, severely downplayed in 4th edition in lieu of your battle maps and other things that can net Wizard more profit in their coffers. Unlike 3.5, though, that seemed to kind of toss it by the wayside as something that you did in between fights, 4th edition seemed to want to micromanage everything. It wanted to control everything. It wanted to have stat blocks and sets just for every single solitary thing, that it felt like you weren't actually getting immersed. It felt like you were always just making another check and making another roll between kind of boringly staring at your dice. I mean, you can argue something similar that happens in any role-playing game, but typically speaking, the game facilitates you kind of chit-chat with dice rolling in between. Everything felt micromanaged here. It felt like you didn't really get to play a character. It felt like you were in control of just a giant set of stats, and you essentially acted out the world as it was constructed. Once again, similar to an MMORPG, your entire character is built in your head, and mainly you're very constrained to whatever the game allows you to do. Just like everything else, we find ourselves back to the MMO debate. No matter where we end up with it, it cannot be denied that 4th edition borrowed a little too heavily from the thing that inspired, and they paid the price heavily. As such, 4th edition, while being a mediocre game, is going to forever go down in history as one of the worst. As we come to an end in this video, once again, I do want to stress very clearly that I do not think that this is a horrible game. I think that there are aspects of the game that work. And whenever you have something like D&D, where there's so many great minds that get to work on, and there's so many just great ideas out there, the worst D&D will always be better than the best of some other RPG series. Like, 4th edition is not a great game, it is a mediocre game, but it is certainly better than a lot of the games out there that I've seen before. There are things about it that work. So, if you're a fan of 4th edition, if you like 4th edition, if you thought it was a good experience for you, I wouldn't take this video as everybody just shitting on the thing that you like. If you like 4th edition, by all means, go at it. I'm not here to say that this game deserves to be in the realm of Hot Chicks and Fatal, where the game shouldn't be played. But I am going to give the game a miss. And the reason being, once again, is that it's not a really great game. And by the standards of what D&D is, you certainly expect a lot better than this. So, thank you all so much for watching. Please like and subscribe for more. And please, come back again for some more great content.